Our final presenter in this session is Annika Wolff, presenting on behalf of Martyn and Rebecca Ferguson, another OU team, I think.
Yes, so as mentioned, I'm presenting on behalf of Martyn Cooper. This is predominantly his work, so I'm going to do my best to do it justice and explain what he's done in terms of trying to support disabled students through the use of learning analytics. I'm going to describe what he's done, but I think another job of me is to sort of promote the idea, particularly to practitioners of learning analytics, that they might want to consider in their own practice how they might, what they're doing might be able to be used for the benefit of disabled students, because this isn't something that's talked about to a great extent at the moment. So, to set the context, I think Kevin's done a really nice job for me of sort of setting the context of what we do at the Open University in terms of predicting student dropouts. We're going to try and apply that to specifically to disabled students, and I think the motivation for this is morally we kind of think we want to support all students that engage with learning materials, so whether they're disabled or have other issues. We want to give an equitable experience for all. There's also legislation in many countries which do say that you have to take accessibility into consideration when you're developing your learning materials, particularly distance learning materials. There's a number of potential barriers for people accessing this, and as Kevin mentioned, particularly at the Open University, we have a large number of people who engage who are disabled, so we need to understand better how to support them. So one way of doing this is through using web standards. So there's obviously a lot of standards available for web design, and when you're creating distance learning materials, then you can take those into consideration, but they're not the whole story. They're not perfect, and they won't address all the problems that a disabled student might have. So we need to understand what are the problems that students are experiencing and how we can improve their experience. So I think the context has been mentioned. We're talking about the Open University and distance education and the fact that we have a larger than average number of disabled students there. I think there's a general thing around distance learning is that the tutor doesn't get to see students face to face, and that can mean it's hard to spot people that are struggling. And of course this is true of spotting people that are struggling due to accessibility issues. So at the Open University, another issue is that students can declare a disability. So they can flag this up when they join, when they start a course, but they don't have to. So that's another issue. We don't always know when people are disabled. And even if they do declare a disability, there's lots of different types of disability, and they're not all the same, and they're not all going to cause the same problems in engaging with learning materials. So this makes it quite difficult to think how learning analytics can be applied to this particular cohort of students. And of course, disabled students, like any other students, don't necessarily drop out because of the accessibility issues. They have all the other problems that regular non-disabled students would have. So they might drop out for a variety of reasons. It has absolutely nothing to do with their disability anyway. So as mentioned, previous work at the Open University is focused on predicting student dropout using things like demographic data and higher qualifications. I think whether they've declared a disability or not may be used as part of the prediction, but it's not really focused on in terms of understanding how the learning analytics can be used to benefit this particular group of users. So the question that was asked within this work was, can learning analytics tell us something about the accessibility problems with certain modules that are being presented at the Open University? And how does this information compare to using the post-course surveys? Because at the moment, it's quite easy to look at the surveys that students complete, and if they have declared a disability, they might also mention this as part of their feedback to the Open University, but this isn't always a complete form of information, because students, for example, may not mention that that was why they struggled. They may say it's down to different reasons. They may not complete the questionnaire, especially if they've dropped out quite early on. They won't necessarily get as far as completing the survey. So the idea was to find out if learning analytics can kind of somehow complement this source of information. The approach was to compile a large corpus of data. So this was 5 years worth of data, all taken from STEM subjects between 2009 and 2013. There was 1,338 modules, so that represents a huge number of students. And then it was possible to record for each module the number of students who had declared a disability. So as I mentioned, this is only ones that have declared it. There's no obligation that they should do so. And then to analyse the pass and completion rates of the disabled compared to the non-disabled students. So the initial analysis showed that across the data set, the average completion for students was, for non-disabled students, it was 75.3%, and for disabled students, it was 69.5%. And this wasn't like, this was just an average, so if you kind of looked at this in more detail, you would see that actually the OU has improved accessibility, or appears to have improved accessibility over time. So this did improve, and only 3 modules after 2012 had markedly lower or significantly lower completion rates of the disabled versus non-disabled students. So this was a positive thing anyway in terms of the Open University and what's being done to address accessibility issues. But the picture's really more complicated than that, because if you imagine you have a relatively low percentage on any given module of students who are disabled. So if that's 2 students who are disabled on or have declared a disability on the module, and one of them drops out, that's going to have a big impact on your percentage of completing students. So then you could say only 50% of disabled students completed, but if you have 70 or 100 non-disabled students and one of them drops out, then that doesn't really affect your percentage of students completing to the same degree. So this can create a bias on the data set. So to avoid this, some modules were removed, so a decision was made to focus only on modules that had 25 disabled, fewer than 25 disabled students, but I think it was more than 25 disabled students. And that meant that the analysis was now being done on 668 modules, which is still quite a large number of modules and students. And the approach was refined using an approach called odds ratios. This can determine for 2 groups whether one group, and in this case that would be the disabled students, are more likely to achieve an outcome, which in this case was succeeding on the module, than another group of students. So this would be the non-disabled. So it's a comparison between the 2 types of students. And the bigger odds ratio that you get, so the bigger value, the bigger disparity there is between the 2 groups that you're looking at. So you can get the odds ratio for all of these modules to find out what's the odds ratio for the non-disabled student group. But then you need to identify what indicates that there is a significant accessibility issue compared to other issues, because as mentioned, there are various reasons why disabled students might struggle. So this graph shows how the threshold was discovered by identifying where are the ones that really are outliers that are significantly different to the rest of the population, because that's more likely to indicate that the reason for dropout was something to do with their declared disability rather than other reasons. So in this case, the threshold was set by about 3, and as you can see, that's a number of modules across the line that still, according to the analysis of those 5 years worth of data, that still appear to be showing some problems in terms of accessibility for students on the module. And then this approach was validated against the student surveys. So as I mentioned before, students who complete are given or who actively withdraw are given the chance to complete this survey. And this was analysed with data from the 6 modules that was picked from being above the threshold and compared against the odds ratios. And so these were ranked first of all by the odds ratio, so the worst, the highest odds ratio being the worst performing module, and then an independent person ranked also the what they thought were the best to worst performing modules in terms of the feedback that was retrieved from the survey. So this table shows the outcome of this. So actually there was very little agreement between the two rankings, but we have quite a lot of confidence in both approaches, but it just goes to show that you can't rely on any one source of data when identifying these things. So probably, as we said, the post-call survey for many reasons isn't picking up all of the issues related to accessibility. And the problems that the students report quite often in the end of course survey are not related to their disabilities. I mentioned they may focus on other things that were affecting their ability to complete. So moving on to conclusions and future work. One approach that's being investigated is whether you can now discover exactly what the problems are that students are having. So you can identify this module compared quite badly to other modules, but you have no real idea what the accessibility issues were or why students were struggling. So another thing that's being looked at from Zdenek, again from his team, is identifying critical pathways of students. So this is an approach in which you identify week by week the types of materials that students are generally engaging with and that lead them to either a successful or unsuccessful outcome. So in this view, you can say thicker lines are the sort of pathways that more students took, and you can see from this pathways that lead to a lot of students passing, and then the ones that lead to students failing. And if you then filter this according to modules where you think there is an accessibility issue, you might see how these students are maybe following different paths, deviating from the norm for some reason, which could indicate that certain types of resources within that module are causing problems for the students, or maybe they've disengaged completely and they don't do anything week by week. But it'd be interesting to sort of see if these approaches can sort of get a more fine-grained view on why students are struggling and what they're struggling with. And so to conclude, I think that analytics do provide some alternative to other sources of information, but nothing should be used in isolation. So I think the key is to combine all your different sources to build up a better picture of what's going on. And I think in terms of the Open University, then it's interesting and obviously important that we do this type of work, but there's other situations where I think it's important to particularly look at disabled students, and that's MOOCs, because as we know, there's a large number of disabled students that also register onto MOOCs, and this could provide some way of identifying who and why people are struggling on these types of other learning scenarios. So that's the presentation, and I'm happy to take questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay.
Thank you, Annika. I know it's a hard job presenting someone else's work.
It's very hard because
yes.
he didn't even do the slides. So
yeah. Questions?
There's one over there.
Am I missing one? Sorry.
Hi, I might have missed the last part. Would you clarify attracting more students with disabilities to MOOCs who need less accommodations? Was that what was in that last point?
No, the last point was that there are already, I think, higher than, quite a high number of disabled students who declare that they have a disability who join MOOCs. I think this is already known about. So possibility to adapt approaches to identify on MOOCs why disabled students are struggling or where they're struggling.
I have a quick question about the kind of initial causality in the study. The assumption of the work appears to be that if we can design the course just right to make it accessible, students with disabilities will complete or pass. And surely it's a little more complicated than that.
Well, I think then you're making a more equitable environment where they may pass or fail according to the same things that cause other students to pass or fail. So you're making them to be in the same position as other students then who will also struggle for various reasons, but you're taking away some of the impact of their disability. So you're trying to find where they have an unfair experience perhaps compared to other students in terms of they're struggling with a particular mode of presentation of one part of the course, for example.
I suppose in my head I was just wondering if there had been any investigation done at the OU asking students whether they felt that accessibility was an issue that had caused them to
I think from
withdraw.
the post-course survey that does sometimes come.
Okay.
That's the sort of thing that has been used to identify these issues in the past. So whether students say when they have declared disability and you look at their survey results, they sometimes say that was a problem. That
was an issue.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Thank you for topic and presentation. Just a quick question about how you define disability, because according to my experience and work, it seems that results depend very much on how you define it, take into consideration a physical disability or some other types of disabilities, or if you use any proof for that, or just self-reporting. So in our case, the results are quite different if we make different divisions.
I would have to refer back to Martyn. My understanding is at the moment it's just a disability flag. I know that there are different disability types that you can declare, but even that is quite a broad categorisation. Rebecca might be able to help me out, but I believe the only source of information is a declared flag. You assume that people won't declare a disability if they don't have one, but we know that people won't necessarily say, so that we're missing data from a lot of people.
Yeah, there are some standard categories which come out from the government, which we can use. We don't require students to declare a disability. You sometimes find that students during a course may refer to a disability which they haven't flagged up with their tutor. Obviously, some disabilities they don't feel are going to get in the way of their studies. Some disabilities they don't want to talk about. Some disabilities they haven't seen as relevant. I think with the smaller courses, some sorts of disability obviously aren't going to be particularly significant. But when we look at our bigger courses, you know, a big... the equivalent of Social Sciences 101 at the Open University would attract about 5,000 students. So if you've got 13% of them are declared disability, some disability groups are going to be quite significant there. We also use the same categories of disability when we send out surveys to our MOOC learners. So say if we've got 10,000 students registered for a MOOC, we'd see somewhere around 13% and 17% of those register as disabled. Again, some of those disabilities won't impact on their studies at all. They're things like mobility, but some of them, if we can break them down, and you know, when you've got 10,000 registered learners, even small percentages become significant. You can break it down, so you might find that 4 students on your MOOC are completely blind. And if you then present that MOOC 4 times in a year for 3 years, that's quite a lot of blind students are studying that MOOC. And you need to think about, well, how do we deal with that? Is that working with screen readers? If we put a graph in there, are we describing the graph, or are we expecting they can see the graph? When we give them assessment, are we giving them assessment which assumes they can see the pictures, that they saw the people in the videos, or are we actually giving them assessment which deals with their problems as well as with the problems experienced by many other students?
Last call for burning questions. Well, thank you. Thanks to all of our presenters in this session. Thanks for coming.